Welcome to Polaris Live. This is Sarwar Kashmeri welcoming our viewers from around the world to this series of programs on the United States and China in the world. This program is brought to you live in conjunction with the Foreign Policy Association of New York. Viewers can ask questions by using the chat button on the right-hand side of the screen. We'll try to get to as many of them as time allows. As a reminder, PolarisLive.com is a commercial-free, viewer-supported channel. You can help us by subscribing to our YouTube channel and signing up for our newsletter at Kashmeri.com. My guest today is the well-known U.S. historian, Dr. Aminda Smith. She is Associate Professor in the Department of History at Michigan State University, one of the few U.S. historians specializing in modern Chinese history with a particular interest in social and cultural history of Chinese communism. Dr. Smith has written widely on the global histories of the Chinese Communist Party and Maoism. She joins us today from East Lansing, Michigan. Welcome to PolarisLive.com, Dr. Mindy Smith.
Hello, thank you so much for having me. I'm very delighted to be here today.
Thank you. Listen, the Chinese Communist Party runs China, from the tiniest village to the biggest megalopolis. Yet, there are more billionaires in Shanghai than in New York. The world's luxury goods makers rely on Chinese consumers for their profits. Many of China's economists and officials have studied and worked in the capitalist capital of the world, the United States. What kind of communism is this?
It's a good question. And there's an intense debate, right? People from all different places on this sort of political spectrum believe that on the one hand, China is communist, that it's leading the global socialist revolution still. And on the other hand, that it's a capitalist country. And I think in order to answer that question, you have to really ask, what is communism and what is capitalism? And there's no simple answer. Even an indicator like luxury goods may not be a perfect one. There are people, there's a long kind of thread in Marxist thinking which suggests that in fact, communism could produce more luxury goods and distribute them to more people than any system had ever done before, right? Yeah. The idea that, Marx and others thought that capitalism actually was the best economic system that humans had developed to date, and that communism could perhaps take what was great about it, its ability to produce stuff really fast for lots of people, and sort of deal with what was bad about it, like inequality, and actually create, more luxury for everybody. So you can't look at what is being produced as much as how it's being produced and how it's being distributed. But when you're looking at a system where small numbers of people, billionaires perhaps, are becoming wealthier and wealthier by paying very, very low wages to laborers, right, who produce goods that they then themselves don't even necessarily have access to because they can't afford it, then perhaps you're looking at capitalism. And I think that's the situation that we see in China today, for better or for worse.
Well, listen, in part of what you say, I felt a certain amount of oxymoronism, if there is such a phrase. If not, we just invented it. Isn't it also the fact that in communism, one can't own land, one can't own buildings, everything belongs to the state. There is no really entrepreneurial capitalism, and that's a large part that economists would argue is what produces all those goods. So you can't really have one without the other. Does that make sense?
Well, yes. I mean, I suppose what I would say to that is that, there is another long thread within Marxist thinking, which suggests that the sort of capitalist focus on the necessity of private property might be a bit misleading. But I think the other key piece here when we're thinking about China would be that, even on the global left, where people are arguing that China is sort of still leading the world towards global socialism, a lot of people are still not necessarily arguing that China doesn't have capitalist elements. And what they would say, and what a lot of theorists in China say too, is that, Marx always said that we were going to have to go through capitalism to get to communism. That's the popular interpretation that a lot of people use, right? Like that there are things about capitalism which themselves produce communism, including private property and other sorts of things which contribute to how communism is successful as it is, right? And that without capitalism, you don't get to communism because it operates like, if you want an apple tree, you're not going to get there without an apple seed. So that communism will come forth from the elements of capitalism that made it successful. But by the time it gets there, there will be other new mechanisms in place that will be able to ameliorate some of the inequities associated with things like private property, is the argument that's often being made on the Chinese communist side.
That's so interesting what you say, because I was reading not too long ago this new book by David Lee, one of their leading economists, who mentioned that they actually had a weekend retreat when Xi Jinping was the president, to discuss whether the word communism should be removed. And they came to the conclusion after a weekend that no, it shouldn't be, because there are too many people who really still like Mao very much, whose support they needed. And one of the points that came out during the weekend is just what you said, that this could be an intermediate phase, have capitalism to transition to a more perfect society. For some reason, this is not widely known. Now, could it also be, I guess these are two questions in one, could it also be a way for China to explain to their own people this dichotomy between the economy, capitalist economy, and what they really supposedly believe in their hearts? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, right? And I think there are a lot of people who think that the maintenance of the name communism, Communist Party, really is just about maintaining legitimacy, right? They would argue that there's nothing communist going on in China anymore, that the economy is essentially capitalist for all practical purposes, and that it's there then communism in name only. But I don't know. I mean, who knows what's in the deepest hearts of the people who make these kinds of claims. But I do know that when you go to Chinese universities, you hear a lot of people talking about Marxism and really actually talking about the limits of US style liberalism, capitalism, and democracy, and really trying to grapple with the challenges posed by a system where the US has hegemony, right? And it pushes these particular kinds of values. And so even if somebody at the top, like Mao Zedong at one time or Xi Jinping now, doesn't believe in Marxism, I don't know whether they do, like it doesn't matter in some ways if on the ground people are really having these conversations about how we move forward under a possibly more equitable economic and political system. Now, I don't know that that's bearing a lot of fruit in China right now in terms of ending immiseration and distributing goods more equitably. But I like the conversations. I like to hear them.
Right. Well, why isn't there, you think, a better understanding of the Chinese Communist Party in the United States? I mean, it sounds like they and we ultimately have their people and our people's interests at heart. So is it that whenever one thinks of communism, one thinks of it as the Soviet style, and that turns people off immediately? What do you think?
I think, yes, I think there are kind of three reasons. The first is what you just said, that there is a lot of fear about communism, which is maybe based on things that people in the US heard about the Soviet Union or heard about China. I think the second reason is that communism and communist ideology does pose a real challenge, as I just said, right, to some of the things that a lot of people in the U.S. value, U.S. style liberal democracy, capitalism, things like that. I think another reason is that precisely because communism posed that kind of an ideological challenge, it was once taken very seriously as a real competitor to the kind of system that we have in the U.S. But after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, people were sort of able to say, well, communism has shown itself not to work. People like Margaret Thatcher were able to say, for all of its limitations, there's not really an alternative to the capitalist system that we have now. And as a result, people didn't need to, they didn't think, learn that much about communism or understand a communist country. And they were able to sort of accept those more cynical views. Like, the people who were trying to enact communism also knew that it wasn't going to work. And so it was always just kind of a cynical power grab. And if that's true, then, we're just talking about maybe garden variety authoritarianism, and there's no real reason to try to understand that. And then I think the third reason that there's not a better understanding of China in the US does have to do with the international left, who I think have also sort of restricted inquiry into what's going on in China, at least some sectors of it, because there's been a sense, it's kind of the enemy of my enemy is my friend sort of a discourse. And for people who are really opposed to US foreign policy, they kind of see China as the only country that has the ability to challenge that. And so there's been a sort of a resistance to criticizing China from that perspective as well. So you've got resistance both on the right and on the left to really sort of looking carefully at China and trying to figure out what the Chinese Communist Party is and what it does.
So, Dr. Smith, I wanted to dig in a little bit more into your understanding of the Chinese governance system, right? The Chinese Communist Party prides itself in being highly meritocratic, merit-based system. Qualified, experienced, proven officials rise. I mean, there are 62 million, as I understand it, members of the Communist Party, and people have to prove themselves as they ride up to the apex. Is this true, that this is a very merit-based society?
Well, I guess in order to answer that question, my first question would be, is there really such thing as meritocracy anywhere? I mean, by what standards would we judge that kind of a claim? I am no longer convinced.
Let me, sorry, I'm going to interrupt. Very rude thing to do, but I'm known for being very rude in these videos. The point is always made, a small example, that when America appoints ambassadors to important countries, France, UK, it's generally people who've given money to the party that's in power, right? In China, you can't come to an important country as an ambassador like the US unless you have years of experience in that position and you've risen through their foreign policy ranks. Small example.
Yeah, and perhaps that is the kind of thing that we would want to look at. I mean, any meritocracy is always going to have its limits. I think in China, like in the US, if you look at the statistics, probably most of the people who are in positions of power do come from backgrounds where they had more advantages, right? They were able to get into better universities, which in a lot of cases means that their parents had more access to resources, not always, but in some cases. But, there was an article in the New York Times a few years ago that really made an impact on me. And it asked about this question of the American dream and meritocracy and hard work. And it sort of wanted to test whether or not that was still available in the US or anywhere in the world, right? You could get this middle-class life or better by working really hard, no matter where you came from.
Yes.
They compared sort of two, I think they were imaginary, like 18-year-old men, one in China and one in the US, who came from nothing. And based on statistics and also on sort of pathways to success, they actually argued that you would have a better chance in China today than you would in the US. So I do think that there are strong elements of meritocracy in the Chinese system, but I think it has its limits, as would always be the case.
Okay, I'm going to take a few seconds to remind our viewers that they're watching PolarisLive.com, a commercial-free, viewer-supported channel. We're focused on the most consequential relationship of our time and its impact on the world. You can help us by subscribing to our YouTube channel, signing up to our newsletter at Kashmeri.com. There's no cost for doing that. And now we come back to our eminent historian guest today, Dr. Aminda Smith. And Aminda, let me ask you, do you think it's correct to view President Xi Jinping as a dictator?
Well, I think that Xi Jinping has a great deal of support within the Communist Party, and he has to maintain that support. So I don't think that he has unlimited dictatorial control. I do think, though, that in Chinese communism, in the party, historically and today, there is a higher tolerance for centralized control. Historically, it was a Leninist party, and they shared Lenin's sense that even to lead people through a revolution, you need tight centralized control. And that was for a couple of reasons. First reason is that, you know, capitalism is tenacious, right? It's kind of like the Matrix in that it's in everything. It's even in our views of human nature, right? Might be related to capitalist values, and that the people who have power within capitalism are wealthy and they have a lot of resources. So if you want to control the worst excesses of capitalism, the worst inequalities, you need some strong government interference. Some people in the US agree, right? If you don't want people to become billionaires while other people are immiserated, somebody has to come in and sort of control that. And the second argument is that the masses of the people, even if you want to lead them towards their best interests, are not always aware of what their best interests are. You know, Lenin would say that, for example, people would accept trade unions, which are only a small kind of a compromise because it gives them immediate material benefits. But, you know, he would have said that that forestalled the revolution. So you need, again, tight control there. And that might sound cynical. It might sound like, okay, so what that means is that whatever the Communist Party says then is in the interest of communism. And if you disagree, it's either because you're a billionaire or because you don't know what your own interests are. But it's similar to the argument that people in the US make, you know, like if people in Kansas really knew their own interests, they would not vote for Trump or something like that, right? So I think there is a sense, again, that if you're trying to grapple with the limitations of a US-led liberal democratic capitalist system, you need tighter control, and that maybe democracy has its own limitations, right? Has its own instabilities. The People's Daily loves to bring up examples of times when democracy seems to fail in the US, like on January 6th, in order to say, is this really the best system if what you want in the end is to give people food and stability?
Do you think that this is, I'm tangenting a bit, I'll come back to the main theme, but you know, this war between Russia and Ukraine and the Western American-led sanctions, it's been described as a battle war between authoritarianism and democracies. But the largest democracies in the world are not supporting 80% of the population. The largest democracies, Indonesia, Malaysia, India, you know, South Africa, they're not supporting the US position on sanctions. And do you think, based on what you said, that this ties in to that people are thinking there yes, capitalism is good, but there's some gradations of that there are some bottlenecks on that. What do you think? Is there a connection?
Well, I certainly think that there is growing dissatisfaction around the world with US hegemony in global politics, right? I think a lot of people, precisely because of the challenges that we're facing in, you know, global capitalism, but also because of, you US decisions in terms of foreign policy, there's a lot of dissatisfaction and a lot of people who are just not as readily willing around the world to just give the US the benefit of the doubt that whatever they're supporting is in the support of, a better world globally and for everyone. I think those promises, at least as far as a lot of people are concerned, haven't really panned out. Like the situation around the world has not got better for a lot of people under that sort of, US-led, set of compromises. And so I think, I don't know whether they're completely ready to abandon it, but I think there's a lot more tolerance for anyone who seems to pose a challenge to that US system. And that includes China and it includes Russia.
So let me ask you, Mindy, the Chinese Communist Party has around 69 million members, as I understand it. Right? China's population is about 1.3 billion. So are the other Chinese second-class citizens?
I mean, it's a good question, and it's similar to asking, are people who don't get into elite universities or maybe like the top 100 universities or whatever in the world second-class citizens? And I don't know, but I certainly do think that there are great deals of privilege and access that come with those kinds of organizational affiliations, whether it's an alumni association or the Communist Party, right? I do, I would defer to people who really study today's party membership a little bit on this question, but I guess from my anecdotal experience with friends and colleagues who are party members versus those who are not, I certainly think that it is a pathway to success, and there are other pathways to success, but this is one of the best ones. And a lot of the people I know who joined the party precisely because that was their impression, that maybe you would be something of a second-class citizen in terms of achieving your goals if you were not a party member.
One of the things that I've heard when I ask this of my friends in China is that you don't have to join the Communist Party unless you want to be in a leadership governance position, mayor, provincial chief, and so on. And that the other people who want to start companies and be capitalists can just go ahead and do that as long as they live within the stand. So do you think there's something to that?
There might be something to that. I certainly think that if you want a career in politics, you're going to want to join the party.
Yes.
But I think that a lot of my colleagues also thought that they would have stronger careers in academia and in other fields. So starting a business, being an entrepreneur in a small town, maybe it may be less clear whether or not you need to join the party, but I think it goes beyond political careers as well, the influence and the access that you get with that membership.
Okay. Now, China's, of course, done an incredible job of raising the standard of living of hundreds of millions of people in a brief 4 decades. So why hasn't it moved, do you think, towards becoming a more democratic Western type state as a lot of people had assumed it would?
Yeah, that's a very good question, because you're right. That used to be an important assumption. I mean, it wasn't the assumption as much in China as people might have thought, but it definitely was the assumption on the part of people in, U.S. policymakers, for example, diplomats, right? I remember in the 90s, people saying, oh, China is going to become just like the U.S., anytime. But the truth is that in China, there was always a strand of real resistance to that idea. And Xi Jinping himself comes out of that tradition. People who, again, were critical of U.S. hegemony, of U.S. foreign policy, and they actually did not want China to become more like the U.S. precisely because they thought that China had the opportunity to be a real challenge, to pose a real challenge to that world order. And in fact, there are a number of theorists in the party and at prestigious Chinese universities arguing that we can thank Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communists more generally for making sure that we didn't end up in that sort of end of history moment, right? Where we're all like the US and the US is in charge of everything. And so I think one of the reasons that they didn't end up more like the US was a very purposeful attempt not to. And the people who had that view ended up coming to power, partly because of it, I think.
Fascinating. And so the question again on the Chinese Communist Party, which I think we are all just starting to understand, and we need to talk more to people like you. The point is always made that China is almost never going to be interested in propagating its style of governance around the world, as the Soviet Union wanted to do, because they realized that the situation, governance in China right now is based on a couple of thousand years of history, and that it's one of a kind, sui generis, and that it really can't be transplanted in other countries just by throwing a switch. Do you believe that?
I don't know. I think that a lot of people in China really aspire to that ideal, right? I mean, this is something that Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai argued as well, right? And again, this is part of posing a challenge to the US model. They would say, you know, the US will help you, but they'll tell you that you've got to do what they do, right? You've got to do it their way. You've got to adopt their political system, their economic system, and we're not going to do that. We have a goal, which is that the majority of the people have a more prosperous life, and we're willing to go out around the world and help with that. And we want you to interrogate the conditions of your own society and figure out what kind of political system is best for you. That being said, I think part of standing up to the US and posing a challenge to the US is also trying to move people away from an adherence to the kinds of values that the US is trying to propagate. And I don't know if that's the same thing as propagating your own thing, but it also is applying standards to other people's governance, right?
Difficult questions that we're opening here for discussion. This is going to be, Mindy, I hope, the first of programs where we explore this issue of and which leads me, as we run towards the end of our conversation, many Americans have an instinctive hatred for the word communist, right? Do you think this is a residue of the Soviet Union? I was listening to one of the congressional committees interviewing the CEO of TikTok, the social media organization that America wants to sell, had the China to sell. And the questioning was along the lines of, this is to the CEO who's from Singapore, are you a communist? Have you ever been a communist? Have you ever thought about joining a communist party? Almost as though we were living in the 1950s when Senator Joe McCarthy used to use the same line of questioning. Do you think, therefore, that this kind of thinking and hatred comes in the way of better relations between China and the US, and it'll need to change if we are to improve this daggers drawn permanent relationship?
Yeah, I absolutely think so. I mean, I think that the problem is that a lot of people associate communism with some of the worst things that happened in places that tried the communist experiment, whereas they associate democracy and capitalism only with some of the best things that have come out of places where we've tried the democratic and the capitalist experiment, right? And I think if we look at both systems in both their in terms of their strengths and their limitations, then we see, you know, something similar to what you said in the beginning, which is that, you know, I don't always know about top leaders, but the vast majority of people in most places, I think, are trying to think about what are the systems that provide the most prosperity and the most freedom to the maximum number of people. And people are trying to work towards those goals. And I see a lot of those goals animating communism in China as well. And so if we could think a little bit more on those terms, we might be able to have more productive conversations about, yes, the real differences between China and the US, but also our commonalities as well.
Right. And it's going to be interesting to see as we head into this presidential election, whether this becomes a topic at all as to whether we need to be improving our relations with China. How should we do it? Maybe it'll be too toxic and they won't be able to touch it. But listen, Dr. Smith, Mindy, we are running out of time here, actually have run out of time. But what I wanted you to know that we really appreciate, and I'm sure our viewers do, your thoughts on this subject, which I at least believe is critically important because, and I hope you agree that this is the most consequential relationship of our time. So with that, let me thank you very much again for appearing on Polaris Live, and I hope we see you back again sometime.
Thank you so much. It's been wonderful to be here. Would be delighted to come back anytime.
Thank you again. And I also want to thank our listeners from around the world. You've been watching another expert on the U.S.-China relationship, and we hope you'll continue to watch PolarisLive.com, support us, and until next time, goodbye.